I will never forget Ellen's scream echoing in that black cave, the ruthless trafficker pressing a gun to her head, and in that same heartbeat, my father, gaunt and desperate, hurling himself into the line of fire to save her. It all happened in a blink beneath the cold earth swarms of furious bees swirling around the hunted. If you think this is just another family story, you're wrong. Subscribe now so you won't miss any of our shocking episodes. Under the molten glow of a late September sunset, the vast forest of maple trees stood in almost sacred stillness, the golden light sifting through their dense canopies, splintering across the open meadows of southern Ontario. In the middle of this living sea, down a gravel drive bordered by wild sumac and ragweed, the Miller Bee Farm pulsed quietly, an island of warmth and routine surrounded by a wild and ancient world. The hives, painted in soft pastels, dotted the rolling pasture like tiny cottages in a forgotten village, each one buzzing with secret life. And every evening, as the day gave itself over to dusk, the whole place shimmered with a honeyed hush, as if even the land itself was exhaling after a long, hard summer. The farmhouse, a sturdy clapboard relic built by Jonathan Miller's grandfather, looked timeless in the last light shutters slightly askew. Windows fogged by decades of cooking and laughter, the wide porch sagging gently under the weight of years and the memory of 1,000 slow mornings. From the open kitchen window drifted the faint sound of an old Patsy Cline song, Karen's favorite. Inside the Miller home was alive with the quiet signs of a family at peace. With its own rhythms, muddy boots lined up by the door, dog-eared seed catalogs on the table, a battered ceramic mug half full of tea, beeswax candles melting down beside a stack of bills no one wanted to open. Jonathan Miller was in every sense a man of the land. Tall and broad-shouldered, with sun-baked skin and deep creases at the corners of his eyes, he moved with the unhurried confidence of someone whose work was always unfinished, yet never in vain. Tonight, as the sun slipped lower, he stood at the edge of his beloved apiary, hands on his hips, surveying his kingdom with a furrowed brow that was equal parts pride and worry. The autumn had come on hot and dry. The bees were listless, the flowers along the creek already browning, and the air itself seemed thin, restless. For weeks now, a new concern had been gnawing at him, a subtle but persistent drop in the hive's productivity. A handful of queens gone missing, and most troubling of all, a strange disturbance in the farthest boxes at the edge of the woods. He had mentioned it to Karen only in passing, trying to spare her from the burden that had begun to shadow his own thoughts. But Karen, whose intuition was as sharp as her wit, had noticed the subtle shifts in her husband's moods, the way he paused at the kitchen sink staring into the distance, as if listening for a sound no one else could hear. The sudden tension in his jaw when the phone rang after dark. His habit of checking the locks on the shed twice each night. She had pressed him once on a Sunday morning as they sipped their coffee in the quiet before chores began. "John, you're not telling me everything," she had said, voice soft but insistent. He had only smiled, ruffling her hair, and promised her that everything was fine. Now, as twilight stretched the shadows long across the yard, Karen watched him from the kitchen window, her heart catching in her throat the way it always did when the world seemed a little too quiet. Jonathan was finishing his last check of the day, moving from hive to hive with a practiced grace, pausing every so often to jot a note in his weathered field book. The bees, sensing the hour, buzzed in thicker, more anxious spirals, their golden bodies catching the light like flecks of fire. He glanced back at the house, saw Karen waving from the porch, and lifted a gloved hand in silent reply. The moment lingered, a domestic painting that belonged to another simpler era. Karen smiled, turning back to the stove to check the soup she'd been simmering all afternoon. She listened to the faint rise and fall of her husband's footsteps in the gravel, the metallic click of the hive tool against wood, the low hum of bees at dusk. It was a sound she had come to associate with safety, with the ordinary magic of a life built from sweat and honey. The phone rang, its old-school jangle echoing in the small kitchen. Karen wiped her hands and answered, half expecting it to be her sister or a neighbor with a question about the coming frost. Instead, it was silence, a breath maybe on the other end. She frowned, hung up, and shook off the chill that crawled up her arms. There had been prank calls before, kids from the high school daring each other, she imagined. Still, as she glanced out the window, she realized she could no longer see Jonathan at the edge of the yard. The trees had swallowed him, their branches reaching down like dark fingers to draw him deeper into the woods. The sun dropped below the horizon. Shadows spilled over the fields and gathered at the forest's edge. Karen called out through the screen door, voice light but edged with worry. "John, dinner's almost ready." No answer. Just the steady chorus of crickets and the distant yip of a coyote. The bees, too, had grown quiet, their day's work done. She waited, listening, one hand clutching the phone, the other braced on the cool enamel of the sink. Minutes ticked by, slow and syrupy. Karen walked out onto the porch, arms wrapped around herself against the sudden chill. The wind shifted, carrying the sweet, sharp tang of smoke from a neighbor's chimney, mingled with something else, something she couldn't quite name. She peered toward the apiary, searching for Jonathan's lantern bobbing between the hives, but the yard was empty, swallowed by creeping mist and lengthening dark. A wave of unease rolled through her. She stepped into her boots, grabbed the heavy flashlight that always sat by the door, and headed into the yard, the porch light casting a long, lonely beam across the grass. Each step felt heavier, the world suddenly too big, too full of secrets. Her voice cut through the darkness, sharper now. "John, where are you again?" Silence. She made her way toward the last place she'd seen him flashlight beam, jerking from hive to hive, catching only glimpses of movement, moths spiraling in the light, a raccoon darting between trees, the glint of a forgotten pail. Near the edge of the woods, she found Jonathan's jacket draped over a fence post, as if he'd stepped out of it in a hurry. The pocket bulged with his old field book still open to the morning's notes. She picked it up, heart pounding, and flipped through the pages. The last entry was scrawled hastily, almost illegible, "Unusual activity at West Hives. Will check at dusk." She scanned the tree line, every instinct screaming that something was wrong. The flashlight flickered. The batteries were dying. She cursed under her breath and hurried back to the porch. Inside, she tried Jonathan's cell phone, letting it ring until the voicemail picked up. She left a message, trying to keep her voice steady, fighting the urge to sound panicked. "John, it's me. Dinner's ready. Call me, okay?" She hung up and stared at the silent phone, willing it to ring, to shatter the gathering darkness with the sound of his voice. She checked the kitchen clock. 30 minutes had passed since she'd last seen him. Too long, she thought, for a simple hive check. She wandered from room to room, trying to busy herself folding laundry, stirring the soup, setting the table for two. But her movements grew more frantic with each passing minute, her mind filling with images. She tried to banish. Jonathan slumped against a hive, stung into unconsciousness. Jonathan lost in the woods, injured and calling for help. She replayed every conversation they'd had over the past week, searching for a clue, a sign she had missed. The phone call, the prank, or was it something else? The memory of the last brief argument they'd had surfaced with a stab of guilt. She tried to laugh it off, tried to tell herself that Jonathan was fine, that he would come through the door any minute, smile crooked, and say, "Sorry, love, lost track of time." But the fear kept gnawing deep and insistent. Out in the yard, the wind picked up, rattling the empty hives and sending a scatter of dead leaves tumbling across the gravel. The air felt different, colder, heavier. The forest loomed, its darkness now absolute. She called again, louder this time, voice cracking at the edges. "John, answer me." Still nothing but the wind and the low, mournful moan of a distant owl. She grabbed Jonathan's old hunting rifle from behind the door, more for comfort than protection, and stood on the porch, eyes locked on the tree line. Every childhood fear she'd ever had about the woods came rushing back, stories of shadows that walked, things that watched from between the trees, the land itself holding its breath. Her imagination raced ahead, wild and unmoored, conjuring dangers both real and impossible. The sky went from gold to bruised purple, then black. The world beyond the porch light was gone, erased by the night. She tried Jonathan's phone again, voice trembling now. "Please, John, just call me." The message was swallowed by static. Inside, she sank onto the kitchen floor, back pressed to the cool plaster wall, knees drawn to her chest. She listened to the silence, to the relentless ticking of the old clock, to the small, ordinary sounds that suddenly felt terrifying in their normalcy. The drip of the faucet, the settling of the house, the hiss of the soup boiling over. Outside, somewhere in the darkness, the bees waited. The woods watched. And Jonathan Miller was gone. The first thing Karen felt was the silence. Not just the kind that settles in the absence of noise, but a silence that pressed against her eardrums and tightened her chest. She had always believed that in the country, true silence didn't exist. There was always something: the wind in the maples, the thrum of crickets, the reassuring hum of the bees drifting home at twilight. But now, as she stood on the porch staring into the deepening night, there was only a thick, unnatural hush. It pressed closer with every passing minute. She called for Jonathan again, her voice echoing across the empty yard and vanishing at the edge of the woods. Still nothing. The beam of her flashlight jittered across the grass, trembling in her grip. Every step she took toward the apiary felt wrong, as though she was wading into something heavy and invisible, a current pulling her deeper into dread. She wanted to believe he'd simply gotten distracted, maybe following a swarm or checking on a weak hive. But the rational part of her mind began to tally the minutes, then the hour. Jonathan would never have left her waiting this long. He was many things, but unreliable was not one of them. She reached the first line of hives, the flashlight's yellow beam cutting through the mist that now hovered low to the ground. The world beyond its light seemed to fall away. Trees pressed closer, the pasture shrank to a small, uncertain island. Karen forced herself forward, one boot in front of the other, whispering Jonathan's name as if afraid to break the spell of the night. Her heart hammered in her ears. At the far edge of the field, where the fence curled toward the tree line, she found his truck. The old Ford was parked at an odd angle, its driver's door wide open. The headlights were off, but the dome light glowed feebly, painting the interior in pale, sickly hues. The keys dangled from the ignition. On the passenger seat, Jonathan's phone lay face up, screen black, battery dead. His old .22 rifle, usually kept behind the seat or slung across his back when he went into the woods at dusk, was propped upright against the driver's side tire, strangely clean, as if just set there and forgotten. Karen's breath caught. This was wrong. All of it. Jonathan never left his truck open, not even when he was just a few yards from the house. He never ever left his rifle behind. She circled the truck, calling his name in a voice that was already becoming ragged with fear. She knelt to touch the rifle, half expecting it to be warm, to hold some clue in its weight or scent. Nothing. Just cold steel, lifeless wood. No sign of a struggle, no broken branches, no churned mud or footprints. The ground was hard, and undisturbed grass flattened only in the places she expected. It was as if he had simply vanished, erased by some silent force that left everything else untouched. A primal terror, ancient and irrational, threatened to unmoor her completely. She forced herself to stand, took one shuddering breath after another, and dialed Jonathan's number again on his phone just in case. The device gave nothing back, not even a flicker. She checked her own cell, but there was no service this far from the main road, not at night. Her hands shook as she hurried back toward the house, every instinct screaming that she was leaving him behind. She grabbed the landline from the kitchen wall, nearly tearing it out by the roots, and jabbed at the numbers. Her voice shook as she spoke to the 911 dispatcher, words tumbling out sharp with panic, her husband missing his truck and gun, left behind no sign of where he'd gone or if he'd ever left the property at all. She repeated herself maybe too many times, sensing the operator's tone change from patience to thinly veiled concern. "Stay inside, ma'am," they told her. "A unit is on the way. Keep the line clear." But the house felt too empty, too small. The walls pressed in as tightly as the darkness outside. Within half an hour, though, it felt like eternity. The first patrol car swung into the gravel drive, headlights splitting the night, casting stark shadows against the barn and the sagging fence line. Sheriff Lucas, a bear of a man with a clipped beard and a battered Stetson, stepped out, flanked by two deputies. His boots crunched on the gravel as he approached, face set in the grim lines of someone who'd seen too many bad nights begin with a single, unexplainable phone call. Karen met him at the porch, voice already trembling, eyes wild with fear and disbelief. He wouldn't leave, she insisted. John wouldn't just go off. Not without telling me. Not like this. Lucas listened, nodding, asking quiet questions with a calm he'd spent years perfecting. When Karen described the abandoned truck, the gun, the dead phone, his brow furrowed, not in skepticism, but in recognition. He'd seen this before, or something like it. People didn't just vanish in Maple County, but every lawman knew that the woods kept their own secrets. He led Karen and his deputies out toward the truck flashlight beams, slicing through the thickening mist. The woods, even at the edge, felt alien now, alive in ways that made her skin crawl. Branches creaked overhead, and the wind hissed through the grass, but otherwise there was only the squelch of boots and the distant sigh of cattle somewhere in the dark. They circled the truck, Lucas cataloging every detail. The way the door hung open, the rifle's placement, the phone on the seat. He knelt beside the tire-gloved hands, hovering over the ground, searching for any disruption, any evidence of a struggle. But the earth told no stories tonight. The only prints were Karen's and a few deer tracks wandering through the mud. No blood, no drag marks, no torn fabric or dropped possessions. The woods at the edge pressed closer, black and impenetrable, as if swallowing up the trail before it began. Lucas turned to Karen, his voice gentle but direct. "You sure John didn't say anything strange? No trouble with anyone lately? No reason he'd leave?" He was worried, Karen admitted, voice breaking. About the bees, about the farm. But not like this. He was just going to check the hives, that's all. He nodded, one hand on her shoulder. "We'll find him. Let's keep looking." He turned to his deputies. "Fan out. Stay within sight. Mark anything that looks off." He radioed for backup a few more deputies, a K-9 unit, and a request for search and rescue volunteers. Already the news was crackling across local scanners, the Miller farm's name on every tongue in town. As the first searchers arrived, friends, neighbors, members of the volunteer fire brigade, Lucas organized them into teams assigning each a sector. The pasture, the creek bed, the old maple stands where Jonathan sometimes went to cut firewood. Karen watched as the beams of their flashlights bobbed and wove through the darkness, painting wild, dizzying patterns against the trees. The air seemed to grow colder with each passing moment, as if the woods themselves resented the intrusion. Somewhere behind her, the radio squawked with updates. "Nothing at the east line. No sign near the pond. Dogs haven't caught a scent yet." The searchers' voices grew strained, the tension tightening as the minutes crawled by. Karen moved between groups, her flashlight clutched in white-knuckled fists, calling Jonathan's name until her throat ached and her voice grew hoarse. Every rustle of leaves, every crack of a twig made her spin, heart leaping, only to find nothing. Just shadows and more shadows. The search spread wider, flashlights sweeping through the labyrinth of tangled brush, over logs and stone walls, through fields pocked with the last wildflowers of the season. Someone found Jonathan's glove abandoned near the west fence line. But it was clean, as if just dropped. Another found his field hat hanging from a low branch. Still, there was nothing to suggest violence, no sign of injury or fear. Just absence and emptiness that seemed to swallow everything. Karen's mind ran through every possibility, every rational explanation. Maybe he'd chased after a stray animal or gone to help a neighbor and gotten lost in the gathering dark. But nothing made sense. Not the open truck, the untouched gun, the dead phone. She felt the cold coil of panic tighten around her chest, squeezing tighter with every unanswered call. Lucas regrouped the teams at the edge of the woods, voices low and urgent. He spoke to Karen quietly, promising her they would search all night if they had to, that they would bring in more dogs at first light. Karen nodded, barely hearing him. Her tears finally spilled over, hot against her cheeks, as she pressed her hands to her face, stifling a sob. The world had narrowed to the sharp beam of her flashlight, the chill of the night, and the unyielding, implacable silence of the forest. Around her, the searchers' voices grew more hushed, as if the woods themselves demanded reverence. The cold crept in, seeping through her jacket, her bones. Her breath made pale ghosts in the beam of her light. Someone put an arm around her shoulders, and she clung to the comfort like a lifeline. As the hours passed, it became clear Jonathan was truly gone. The search continued, but the mood shifted, hope giving way to dread confidence, replaced by the terrible weight of not knowing. The woods, once a place of beauty and promise, had become a labyrinth of unanswered questions, each shadow hiding the possibility of something worse. Karen stayed at the edge of the field, staring into the black wall of trees, waiting for a sound. A voice, any sign that the man she loved was out there somewhere, waiting to come home. But there was only the wind and the cold and the silence so deep, so total, that it seemed to swallow the world whole. The night bled into morning, and then another, the boundary between fear and exhaustion, smearing in the uncertain gray light. Karen did not sleep. She dozed half upright in an armchair, the phone always in her lap, ears straining for the smallest clue. By dawn on the second day, the Miller farm had transformed into something between a command post and a wake. Squad cars, trucks, search and rescue vans clogged the gravel lane. A folding table coffee water maps stood under the old maple at the edge of the yard. The screen door banged every few minutes as deputies came and went. Every time, Karen jerked up, heart in her throat, praying for good news and dreading bad. Sheriff Lucas moved between groups, his boots caked with mud, radio clipped to his shoulder. At the heart of the operation, the air bristled with the clipped urgency of professionals at work, short efficient bursts on walkie-talkies, the low rumble of men and women discussing grid lines, scent cones, and topographical maps. They had done this before. Missing hikers' runaways even years ago, another farmer lost to winter's first whiteout. But everyone knew this was different. This was Jonathan Miller, and everyone in Maple County owed him something. A favor, a jar of honey, a story from the farmer's market, a bit of wisdom delivered with a smile. The community came out in full force. Before sunrise, volunteers arrived. Rough-handed men with tired eyes, women with thermoses of coffee, teenagers with dogs on fraying leashes. Many were indigenous Ojibwe elders, and youth, their faces marked with worry, arriving in battered pickups and silent groups, offering their knowledge of the land, the river, the subtle ways the forest could change overnight. No one needed to ask why. In these parts, the forest didn't just hold secrets. It remembered debts and loyalties that went back generations. The search began as the sun rose pale and flat over the fields, dissolving the last scraps of mist. Lines were drawn on the map: pasture, creekbed, the northern woods, the wild sumac tangles where the bees sometimes swarmed. Teams fanned out, orange vests flickering between the trees. The air filled with the staccato barks of search dogs' handlers, coaxing them along with bits of Jonathan's clothing, hoping for a scent. For the first few hours, hope ran strong. Voices echoed confident, as if saying his name loud enough would summon him back. Jonathan Karen's own voice grew hoarse, but she did not stop, did not dare to rest. The first day, nothing. A few boot prints, the deputies said. A torn scrap of fabric near the beehives, probably from Jonathan's jacket, but clean and dry as if it had been snagged days before. The dogs ran circles through the brush, noses low, tails high, but never once barked or sat, no hit, no trace. At noon, a lunch of stale sandwiches eaten without appetite. By sundown, a cold front moved in, and the searchers lit lanterns and built small fires at the edges of the property, as if trying to hold back the growing dark with points of light and warmth. On the second night, it rained. A steady, implacable downpour that turned the fields to muck and washed away whatever clues might have lingered. Still, the search went on. The volunteers came back, boots sloshing, faces streaked with mud. Karen sat wrapped in Jonathan's old flannel, a blanket around her shoulders, and watched the world shrink to the circle of lamplight under the maple tree. By the third day, worry deepened into something raw and jagged. Faces grew pinched. No one told jokes anymore. No one talked of anything but the search. The Miller farmyard was trampled into a churned wasteland. Too many boots, too many desperate hopes. Local reporters began to appear, parking along the road and training their cameras on the house, hoping for a soundbite, a break in the case, or simply a shot of suffering to fill the evening news. Karen ignored them, moving through the crowd like a ghost. She felt every hour in her bones. At night, she wrote notes to herself, lists of where they'd searched, names of those who'd helped, reminders to check in with the deputy coordinating efforts. Sometimes when the wind shifted, she thought she heard Jonathan's voice calling her name from the woods, faint and urgent. She would stumble outside in her slippers, only to find darkness, her breath white in the cold air. By the end of the week, the search had widened. Hundreds of acres combed, drones flying overhead. Mounted patrols brought in to cover the roughest ground. The Ojibwe searchers worked quietly, marking trees with bits of cloth, reading the language of moss and lichen. Sometimes they paused, sharing brief murmured conversations in their own tongue, glancing uneasily toward the deepest part of the forest. Karen noticed this, and though she didn't ask, she sensed their fear, their respect for the land's mysteries. And then the strangeness began. First, the hives, on the fourth morning. 2 of the oldest boxes at the far edge of the apiary were found, toppled lids, wrenched off frames scattered in the grass. No honey, no bees, just the ghostly hum of emptiness. Jonathan's hives were his pride. He never left them unsecured, never let them go untended. More alarming, though, was what was missing, not just the bees, but the queens. The marked queens, easily identified by a spot of red paint on their backs, were gone. Someone or something had taken them. Sheriff Lucas and his team cataloged the scene, photographing every broken frame, every muddy print. But the tracks around the hives were too large for raccoons or bears, too small for deer, oddly flat and shapeless. They found similar prints near the truck, and once in the soft dirt by the creek, a single deep impression, almost like a boot, but off somehow, as if whoever made it walked with a limp or dragged one foot. By now, Karen's fear had become a constant vibrating presence, an invisible thread pulling tighter every day. She moved through the house in a daze, haunted by memories. Jonathan laughing at the kitchen table, Jonathan tending the bees in spring. Jonathan's arms warm around her shoulders. His jacket hung over the back of her chair, his boots lined up by the door as if he might step back in at any moment, shaking off the mud and reaching for her. Late one night, unable to sleep, Karen found herself in Jonathan's study, a small cluttered room that smelled of wax and smoke, its walls lined with books and boxes of field notes. She sat at his desk, tracing her fingers over the stacks of papers and jars of honey samples, searching for anything that might tell her where he'd gone. In a drawer, she found it, a battered envelope, her name written on the front in Jonathan's unmistakable hand. Inside, a single sheet of paper, the ink slightly smeared, but the message clear. Karen, if you ever find this, I want you to remember the world is bigger and wilder than we can know. There is darkness in these woods, but also hope. Don't let fear close your eyes to the beauty around you. Don't ever give up on me. Don't ever lose hope. Love, Jonathan. She read the note until the dawn seeped through the windows, tears streaming down her face, the ache of loss and longing almost too much to bear. Outside, the forest went about its ancient business, indifferent to human grief. The search continued thinning as the days went by. Volunteers returned to their own lives, deputies moved on to other calls. But the core group, their neighbors, a handful of Ojibwe Sheriff Lucas and Karen herself, refused to stop. They combed the woods, crawled through thickets, checked every old hunting shack, every abandoned well. They followed the dogs through waist-high grass, hoping for a single thread to pull a clue to cling to. One afternoon, as Karen trudged along the creek bed with Lucas, she noticed something glinting in the water, a tiny gold bead caught between 2 stones. She recognized it immediately, the charm from Jonathan's watch chain, a gift she'd given him years before. For a moment, hope flared hot and sharp. But there was nothing else. The ground yielded no more treasures, no footprints, no signs. Just the endless, indifferent march of time. The media attention faded, as it always does. The reporters moved on to other stories. The search teams grew smaller. Sheriff Lucas visited every day sometimes, just to sit with Karen in silence. They rarely spoke about the case anymore, having exhausted every theory. Runaway accident, foul play, none of it fit. Jonathan's absence was a wound that refused to close. At night, Karen reread Jonathan's letter, fingers tracing the lines as if she could conjure him back by sheer will. She remembered his voice, the way he'd say her name when the world seemed too much. Don't ever lose hope. She clung to that, made it her mantra, reciting it like a prayer as she moved through the empty rooms of their home. But even hope has its limits. The world grew colder, the days shorter. The hive stood silent, the queens gone. The woods watched and waited, their secrets locked tight. Karen sat by the window, gazing into the trees, and wondered if she would ever hear his voice again. She wondered if hope was enough. On the 8th morning, as the chill of autumn pressed deeper into the bones of the land, a sliver of something close to hope, or at least the possibility of a clue, began to stir among the exhaustion and defeat that had settled over the Miller farm. Karen had barely slept. The lines beneath her eyes had become permanent, and every movement felt as if she was wading through syrup. The search was no longer constant, but staggered frantic when new volunteers arrived, subdued and ritualistic in the slow hours between. It was one of the Ojibwe searchers, Daniel Bird, who remembered the trail cameras. He and Jonathan had set them up earlier in the summer to track a rogue black bear rumored to be prowling near the bee yard. Now, with so many ordinary explanations exhausted, Daniel suggested checking the cameras for any sign of movement at the edges of the apiary. Maybe even for some evidence of a bear gone bold enough to explain the chaos. Lucas, always methodical, took up the idea immediately. He and Daniel crossed the field boots, scraping over the frost-brittle grass to the first camera fastened to a sugar maple at the southwest corner. The device was battered but still alive, its memory card blinking a slow red pulse in the pale daylight. Karen joined them as they brought the camera inside her hands, numb with cold, heart beating with a stubborn animal hope. In the warmth of the kitchen, they slotted the card into Lucas's battered laptop. The images flickered across the screen in a jumpy, silent progression, deer ghosting between trees. A raccoon climbing into a hive, then fleeing as bees erupted in anger. A fox startled by the flash, frozen mid-stride. These images drew half smiles from Daniel and Lucas, but Karen could barely focus. She watched for any hint of Jonathan's silhouette, any human presence at all. Then, in the grainy black and white night frames, something unfamiliar. At first, just a shape at the edge of the apiary, tall, thin, a dark bulk just inside the boundary of trees. Karen's pulse stuttered as Lucas clicked forward the timestamp reading 02:14 a.m. The next frame, the shape closer now, unmistakably, a person, the head and shoulders shrouded by a hood or perhaps a wide-brimmed hat, face obscured by shadow. The figure stood unmoving for several frames, the camera's infrared eye burning bright in the night. Lucas leaned forward, squinting at the image. "That's no bear," he said quietly. They scrolled through the next images. The figure appeared again, this time further down the row of hives, pausing to kneel beside one gloved hand, reaching out frozen by the shutter in a gesture that might have been gentle, almost reverent, if not for the context. Another click, another hour later, the shape returning now carrying something bulky in one arm, disappearing into the trees. The timestamp read 03:41 a.m. Karen's breath came shallow and quick. She didn't recognize the figure. The build was wrong for Jonathan, and the way it moved with a cautious, almost predatory awareness sent a chill through her. The group sat in silence, the weight of implications settling on the kitchen like a winter fog. Someone had been there. Someone human, methodical and fearless enough to move through the bee yard at night. Lucas ordered the team to collect the other memory cards from around the property. The next few hours became a ritual, the slow trudge through frost-laced fields, the anxious anticipation of new images. Each camera offered pieces of the same puzzle frames of the hooded figures, sometimes accompanied by the dim gleam of an LED flashlight, sometimes captured just at the edge of the camera's range, always between the hours of midnight and 4 a.m. But it was the footage from the old maple by the northern fence line that struck hardest. There, in the last few frames, the figure stopped and looked directly into the lens, as if aware of being watched. The hood or hat threw the face into total darkness, but the posture was unmistakable, confident, unhurried, almost taunting. Lucas ran the images through the provincial database, but the technology, like the woods, yielded no answers. No matches, no names. Just the certainty that someone out there was stalking the hives night after night, taking what they wanted. The searchers gathered in the barn for a late morning meeting, the images now tacked to a bulletin board among maps and printouts. For the first time, the air in the room was electric with fear and anger, not just grief. Sheriff Lucas assigned deputies to patrol the woods after dusk, and the Ojibwe volunteers pledged to watch the forest paths in rotating shifts. Karen saw a new tension in their faces, respect for the forest's dangers mingled now with the knowledge that some of those dangers wore human skin. That afternoon, Daniel, accompanied by a young tracker named Noah, began sweeping the area where the figure had last been spotted. The ground was cold and dry, the soil compacted by years of Jonathan's boots. But along the farthest row of hives, they found what they were looking for, a cluster of footprints, deep and oddly shaped. The toe was blunt, the arch wide, and there was a hitch every third or fourth print dragged slightly like a man carrying a burden or favoring an old injury. They marked the prints and called Lucas, who arrived with plaster and a camera. He documented everything, talking softly to himself as he worked. The tracks led away from the apiary, into the thickest part of the woods in exactly the same direction as the missing queens and the vanished honey. For Karen, who stood shivering at the edge of the trees, it felt as if she was looking into the throat of something ancient and hungry. By twilight, another discovery. 3 more hives, untouched until now, stood open and empty. Their frames stripped bare, the combs ripped from their moorings with surgical precision. There was no sign of bear or raccoon, no claw marks, no fur, no spilled honey. Whoever had taken the bees knew exactly what they were after and exactly how to leave without a trace. The feeling of violation, of being watched and toyed with, crept through the searchers and through Karen herself. It was no longer just Jonathan who was missing. Now the farm itself was under siege, its heart being hollowed out in the dark. As night settled, Lucas gathered everyone near the barn to debrief. "We have someone coming here at night," he said, voice low but clear. "Whoever it is, they're skilled. They know how to move without being seen. They know the hives. This is no amateur. But we've got them on camera now. We know their pattern." He looked at Karen, his gaze both apologetic and steely. "We're not giving up." Karen nodded, clutching the faded images of the hooded figure to her chest. Her fear had shifted, grown sharper, more personal. It was no longer the vague terror of loss, but a burning anger at whoever had taken her husband and was now dismantling his life's work, piece by piece. She spent the night at the kitchen table, eyes fixed on the screens, jumping at every rustle outside every distant snap of a branch. The forest felt closer now, pressing against the windows, alive with the possibility of discovery or disaster. The wind rattled the panes, and somewhere out in the dark, the bees were silent, their golden kingdom emptied, their queen gone. And all the while, the camera's grainy images replayed in her mind, the hooded stranger moving with terrible patience, beneath the cold, indifferent stars, slipping always just out of reach, deeper into the woods, where answers hid among the shadows. Rumor traveled faster than the autumn wind through Maple County, snaking down gravel roads and curling under every farmhouse door, coiling in the shadows of the schoolhouse and the dim back booths of the diner. It started as a whisper, just the searchers hunched in the miller's barn, passing around blurry prints from the trail cameras, muttering about the strange hooded figure who haunted the edges of the apiary in the dead of night. But by the end of the week, it was a living thing. It was in the grocery line, in the pews, at Sunday church, in the nervous hush that settled over the playground at recess. The question was always the same. Who was out there stalking the woods, and what did he want with the bees? Maple was a place where people prided themselves on knowing their neighbors, their livestock, every tree and rut and creek bend. Now uncertainty cut through that trust like a cold knife. Doors that once stood unlocked all day now clicked shut after sunset. Curtains were drawn. Children were kept closer, their outdoor hours shortened by the slow, suffocating spread of adult worry. Even the forest itself, once an endless playground, now loomed at the edge of every conversation, a wall of whispering leaves and ancient secrets. Karen felt it most sharply in the silence that grew between her and the people she'd known all her life. Neighbors who used to drop in with pie or fresh eggs now stood awkwardly on her porch. Voices, low eyes darting toward the trees. They brought casseroles and condolences, but also questions, some tender, some sharp. Had Jonathan been in trouble? Was there something she wasn't telling them? Beneath the words she heard it, the fear, the suspicion. If this could happen to the Millers, it could happen to anyone. The children felt it too. At night, their dreams turned wild and jagged. Parents were woken by cries by the sharp staccato of small feet padding down the hall in terror. They spoke of the faceless man, a shadow in a wide-brimmed hat, who slipped between the trees and watched from the edge of the yard. In some stories, he had no eyes. In others, he was made entirely of smoke, able to drift through locked doors and carry people off into the forest without a sound. One little girl, the sheriff's own niece, began sleeping with the lights on, clutching a battered teddy bear to her chest and refusing to go near the windows after dusk. Teachers reported children distracted and fractious, their games turning dark. They played Maple Hunt on the playground, one child playing the hooded figure, others running for the safety of the barn. The laughter rang hollow, edged with something like desperation. It wasn't just children. At the cafe, two old-timers argued bitterly, one insisting the hooded figure was just a local troublemaker, the other swearing it was the same boogeyman who had stalked the county 30 years before, when 3 boys vanished from a campsite upriver. Eyes flicked toward the window where the woods pressed close gold and green in the afternoon sun. No one laughed. As fear thickened, so did the stories. Some said the stranger was a drifter, maybe an ex-logger, maybe a foreigner, maybe not a man at all. Others swore it was something worse, a spirit, the echo of old sins buried in maple soil. The talk grew wild. Every lost dog, every odd footprint or missing chicken was blamed on the hooded figure. Even the weather, a sharp cold snap. A sudden downpour became part of the legend. Nature people began to whisper was warning them. Meanwhile, something stranger still began to happen in the surrounding farms. At first, it was just the millers' hives that suffered. But within days, other beekeepers, Scotty Dalrymple to the east, the Tran family at the southern border. Old Mrs. Talbot, with her single wild hive near the creek, reported the same queens gone boxes torn apart with uncanny precision. The Tran girl found one of their marked queens lying dead in the grass as if she'd been plucked from the hive and discarded. The pattern was always the same, always late at night, always with a quiet efficiency that ruled out raccoons, bears, or pranksters. Sheriff Lucas and his deputies made the rounds, logging complaints, documenting the damage, but with every new incident, the sense of violation deepened. Someone or something was targeting the very heart of the community's livelihood. The town's Facebook group buzzed with theories and warnings. Messages typed in all caps late at night: lock up your hives, stay inside after dark, the hunter's out tonight. Karen watched the fear grow, but she could not allow herself to succumb to it. Instead, she poured her energy into the only thing that felt useful: understanding. If there was a pattern, she would find it. If this was not random, if Maple's pain was part of something larger, then there had to be answers somewhere in the tangled web of local history. She began at the library, combing old newspapers yellowed with time and fragile at the edges. She searched the archives at the town hall, pored over missing persons reports, and clipped headlines from decades past. What she found unsettled her more than she could admit. Maple, for all its surface calm, had always harbored mysteries. There were the disappearances, of course. The 3 boys from the campsite never found. A teenage girl in the 70s, her bicycle discovered on the old mill road, wheels still spinning, no sign of her ever again. A farmhand from the Dalrymple place, gone after a storm, his boots found neatly side by side at the edge of the woods. The stories were always the same. Someone goes missing. The search begins, the forest swallows the trail. Sometimes there were clues, a scarf snagged on a branch, a note scribbled in haste, but most often there was only silence. The names faded from memory, becoming cautionary tales for children ghosts who whispered in the wind. Karen found something else, too, a pattern hidden in the records missed by others who never thought to look. Almost every disappearance happened in the fall, when the maples bled crimson and gold, when the days grew short and the nights sharp. Always near the edge of the forest, always after dark. Sometimes just before a storm. It was as if something woke with the change of season, moved through the woods, on feet light as fog, and left nothing but questions behind. In her digging, she uncovered an older story, still one passed down in Ojibwe families, spoken of only in hushed tones. It was the legend of the Wendigo, the hunger spirit that haunted the north woods, taking those who wandered too far or lingered too long after sunset. She found it in the faded notes of a local historian and stories told around winter fires. The Wendigo was a shadow, a presence not quite human, not quite beast. Karen could not help but see the parallels, something moving through the forest, invisible and unstoppable, leaving emptiness in its wake. Armed with her research, she reached out to the Ojibwe elders, hoping for answers, for some thread to follow. They met her with wary courtesy, offering tea and patience, but little in the way of comfort. One elder, a woman named Annie Skye, spoke quietly of the old days when the woods were alive with spirits, when the boundary between this world and the next was thin as mist. She warned Karen to be careful to trust her instincts and to remember that not all mysteries were meant to be solved. Still, Karen persisted. She gathered every story, every rumor, pinning them to a board in Jonathan's study, red string tracing lines between names and dates and places. She studied the photographs from the trail cameras, the odd prints, the empty hives. She mapped the disappearances, overlaying them with the reports of stolen bees, the times and dates of every strange incident. It was a spider web of loss woven through the heart of Maple. Each night as the wind rattled the windows and the darkness pressed close, Karen sat at Jonathan's desk, the hum of the empty hives echoing in her ears, and felt the presence of the forest, its memory, its grief, its insatiable hunger. She vowed not to rest, not to turn away, no matter how deep the shadows grew. Outside, the rumors swirled, gathering power. The Faceless man became a legend, a scapegoat, a warning whispered from parent to child. But for Karen, it was something else, a riddle, a threat. And perhaps somewhere hidden within the smallest spark of hope that the truth at last might be found. The first time Karen met Elin was in the fading glow of a late September afternoon, with the sun dropping behind the tangled woods and a hush settling over the bee yard. Karen was standing by the old fence hands, wrapped tight around a mug of coffee, gone cold, eyes fixed on the shifting shadows at the edge of the forest. Her mind whirred with maps and timelines, the swirl of loss and rumor, and the echo of Jonathan's voice telling her from some far place not to give up hope. She almost didn't notice the girl, small, maybe 11 or 12, hair the color of crow feathers in a long braid. Clothes too big boots scuffed to gray. She seemed to appear out of the undergrowth, her movements so quiet. It was as if the forest itself had breathed her out. Karen's heart jamming up in her throat started in alarm. "Sorry, I didn't mean to scare you," the girl said, her voice low, uncertain, but holding a confidence that made Karen's fear ebb. She had the calm of someone used to moving unseen, to watching the world before letting it watch her. "It's all right," Karen managed, finding her voice. "You're not supposed to be out here alone. It's not safe." The warning tasted bitter, echoing words she'd said to the neighborhood kids 1,000 times, but now felt painfully empty. The girl shrugged, stepping closer but keeping a wary distance. "My name's Elin. My grandma's Annie Skye. We live down near the river." She hesitated, looking at the house, at Karen's face, at the hives humming soft behind her. "I know what happened. About your husband? Everyone does." Karen studied her for a long moment. There was something familiar in the set of her jaw, in the way her eyes flicked over every detail, sharp and quick. She realized suddenly that Jonathan had spoken about Elin once, months ago. How he'd found her caught in a coyote trap, how she'd refused to cry, how he'd carried her home after freeing her bloodied ankle, and listened as she recited the names of every bird she'd seen that day, not a single tear in her voice. Jonathan had called her tougher than half the grown men in Maple. The memory almost undid Karen, but she steadied herself. "You're the one Jonathan helped last spring, aren't you?" she said softly. Elin nodded, eyes fixed on the ground. "He was nice. Didn't yell at me for trespassing or anything. Gave me honey and said I should stick to the main trails." A silence stretched between them, heavy and complicated. Finally, Elin looked up, her gaze unwavering. "I wanted to help. I heard you were looking for answers. I think I might have seen something weird. But nobody listens to kids." She lifted her chin, stubborn and proud. Karen set her mug down, kneeling to meet Elin at eye level. "I'll listen," she promised, and for the first time in weeks, she felt something loosen in her chest. Elin glanced nervously at the woods, then back at Karen. "It was 2 nights ago. I was coming back from my grandma's, cutting through the west trail by the ridge. There's a place we call the Whispering Cave. My uncle says not to go there at night, but I don't listen much." She grinned a flash of defiance, then sobered. I heard someone crying. Like really crying, but muffled like they were way down underground. I stopped and listened, and it was coming from inside the cave. But when I called out, it stopped. I waited for a long time, but there was nothing. Just my own breathing and the wind. Karen felt goosebumps race up her arms. "You're sure it wasn't an animal? A coyote or something?" Elin shook her head fiercely. "I know what animals sound like." This was different. It sounded like a man, but hurt, scared. I was too scared to go in. My grandma says the cave's got bad spirits. People used to hide there a long time ago, back before anyone can remember. For the first time in days, Karen felt the sharp edge of adrenaline, the faintest glimmer of direction. She pressed gently. "Can you show me where this cave is? Do you think you could take me there?" Elin hesitated, glancing back at the woods. "My grandma wouldn't like it, but if you promise not to tell her I showed you, I can take you. You'll have to come at night, though." That's when the sounds come. The risk shimmered in the air between them, but Karen nodded. "All right, I'll go with you, but only if you promise we're careful. And if anything feels wrong, we come right back." "Okay." Elin agreed, sealing the deal with a nod so grave it was almost ceremonial. They parted for the afternoon, Karen watching Elin's small frame slip into the trees, swallowed by shadow and sunlight, in a way that felt at once natural and impossible. Karen hurried inside, her mind whirling. She'd spent so many sleepless nights staring at maps, timelines, patterns, searching for a break in the circle of vanishing and silence. Now, for the first time, she had a guide. Later that evening, Karen called Sheriff Lucas, filling him in without mentioning Elin by name. She told him about the Whispering Cave, about the possibility of a hiding place, a clue, a sound that might not be imagination after all. Lucas listened, concern and skepticism vying in his voice. He promised to check it out with a deputy, but Karen could tell he didn't believe in ghosts or voices in caves. She decided she'd have to go herself, Elin by her side. That night, she barely slept. When dawn came, she drove to the river and found Annie Skye tending her small garden behind the clapboard house. Karen explained as much as she dared, asking about the cave, about old legends, about any recent trouble. Annie studied her for a long moment, lines of suspicion and sorrow carved deep into her weathered face. "There are places in these woods that remember things," Annie said quietly. "Some memories aren't kind. Some are hungry. If you go looking, make sure you're ready for what you find." She reached out and squeezed Karen's hand, then turned away, the conversation over. That evening, as dusk crept across the fields and the bees quieted, Elin arrived at the Miller farm, her face set with determination. She brought a battered flashlight and a thermos of tea. Together they slipped away, following a deer trail that wound through thick ferns and under tangles of wild grapevine. Elin moved with the silent confidence of someone who'd been raised in the woods, checking her bearings, watching for signs. As they walked, Elin talked quietly, urgently, her words falling like stones in the hush. She spoke of other things. She'd heard the names she'd gathered, the old people who whispered about the forest's mouth, the cave that took, and sometimes returned. Karen listened, the darkness folding closer around them. The sharp scent of moss and earth, a constant reminder of where they were and what they risked. After half an hour, they reached a stand of ancient cedars at the base of a limestone ridge. Elin knelt, pushing aside a curtain of ferns to reveal a low, jagged opening in the rock. The cave mouth gaped in the dusk breath of cold air, streaming out, carrying with it the scent of damp and secrets. They crouched in the shadows, listening. For a moment, all was silence, then faintly the echo of something almost like a voice twisting through the tunnels below. Karen's heart pounded. She felt Jonathan's presence in the hush, his memory a lantern against the dark. She squeezed Elin's hand, and together they listened to the cave, to the forest, to the story that was only just beginning to reveal itself. Elin in that moment became more than a guide. She was the bridge between Karen and a world she had never truly known. A world of old wounds, old wisdom, and just maybe the answer to the mystery that haunted every shadow of the Maple Woods. By the time the next new moon bled into the sky, even the air in Maple seemed charged, nights cold and sharp, the woods haunted by the scent of rot and wild honey. The search for Jonathan, the rash of hive thefts, and the rumors of the faceless man had cast a shroud over the county. But it was in those tense, sleepless hours that the story twisted, the shadows deepened, and the secrets finally began to move. It began with another camera. Daniel Bird, relentless and quiet, had taken to moving the trail cams every night, always searching for better vantage angles the trespasser wouldn't expect. On the third morning of this new strategy, Daniel slipped a fresh card into Sheriff Lucas's hand. No one wanted to look at the images, not with the sun barely up, but they had all learned that darkness often hid its worst truths in plain sight. Karen, drawn by the same raw need that had kept her up night after night, hovered in the background as Lucas and Daniel pulled up the footage on a battered laptop atop the squad car's hood. The sequence was blurry, grainy branches, leaves the ripple of animal eyes in the infrared. And then movement. Two men, faces obscured by hoods and scarves, muscled a heavy wooden crate from the trees, the box so large it took both their combined strength to keep it level. For a frozen instant, the camera caught the outline of a third figure, taller, stiller, wrapped in a dark coat, standing off to one side, head turned away from the lens. The men moved with practiced urgency, weaving through the birches and maples, their boots leaving deep impressions in the leaf litter. The crate, emblazoned with faded shipping marks, seemed to pulse in the artificial glow. At one point, the taller man reached out and tapped the lid, and a faint, frantic scraping could be heard just for a moment on the video's crude microphone before the box was loaded onto the back of a battered flatbed truck. The engine coughed once headlights flickered, and the convoy disappeared into the darkness, leaving only churned earth and the taste of oil in the air. Karen pressed trembling fingers to her mouth. It wasn't just the strangeness of the box, the way the men moved in silence, but the implication this was organized, calculated. Not random acts of rural desperation, but something colder, older, wound tight around the heart of Maple's secrets. The hive thefts, the vanished queens. Jonathan's disappearance all now fit into the shape of a plan. And the faceless man. He was no ghost. He was a ringleader. The revelation was both a relief and a terror. For the first time, Karen could see her enemy's outline. But it meant the danger was greater than anything she'd imagined. It was Elin who insisted they act. "We can't just wait for them to come back," she whispered that evening, her voice tight with urgency. "They're using the lake. I heard my uncle say it about a place near the old logging road. That's where the trucks always go." Karen hesitated. The law was slow, cautious, always a step behind. But she knew in her marrow that she was running out of time. She trusted Elin, trusted the fire in the girl's eyes, and so an hour after midnight, with the woods wrapped in velvet blackness, they set out together, two shadows, among many moving along animal trails, hearts beating out a wild rhythm of fear and hope. The journey to the lake's edge was perilous. The night pulsed with hidden life owls, glided overhead coyotes, barked in the distant fields, branches snapped underfoot. Elin led her confidence, masking how young and breakable she truly was. Karen followed, breath shallow, every sense straining for the first sign of danger. They came upon the place suddenly, a clearing at the edge of the water, the moon glimmering across broken reeds and the husks of rotted rowboats. There were signs of recent activity everywhere. Deep ruts carved by heavy tires, scattered pieces of waxy comb, and splinters of painted wood, bee wings crushed into the mud. The air was thick with the scent of diesel and honey, sweet and sickening, a perfume of violence and loss. Karen knelt, running her hands over the cold earth, and found a boot print, large, angular edges still crisp. She looked up to see Elin staring at the water, her face pale in the moonlight. "This is where they bring them," she said. "The hives. Maybe people too." A branch snapped to their right. Karen froze, her blood turning to ice. Elin's hand clamped around her wrist, pulling her behind a fallen log. From the shadows, figures emerged, three men moving with the silent coordination of those accustomed to dark work. They carried flashlights with the beams shrouded their footsteps. Deliberate voices held low. Two peeled off toward the truck, checking the cargo. The third, tall, broad-shouldered, his face hidden under a wide-brimmed hat, circled the edge of the clearing, scanning the tree line with predatory patience. Karen's heart thundered in her ears. She pressed herself lower, barely breathing, willing herself to be smaller, invisible. Eileen's grip tightened, but the girl's eyes remained fixed on the men, her own fear tempered by an old defiant anger. One of the men called out a word Karen didn't catch, sharp and urgent. The tall figure snapped his head toward their hiding spot, gaze sweeping the darkness. For a terrifying heartbeat, the man stepped closer, his flashlight beam grazing the underbrush just inches from where Karen and Eileen crouched. The silence was absolute. The night held its breath. A moth fluttered into the light, spiraling upward, and the man followed it with his eyes. For a moment, Karen thought he would see them, would reach down and drag them into the open. But a crackle of static burst from a radio at the truck. The men retreated, distracted by new orders, and the tension snapped. Karen seized the moment, whispering urgently to Eileen. They began to crawl slow and silent away from the clearing, through brambles and mud-sharp stones, cutting their hands and knees, the danger behind them, now real and personal. The sounds of loading and engines revving grew fainter as they crept deeper into the woods, not daring to look back. It wasn't until they reached the ridge above the lake, lungs burning, that Karen dared to rise to her feet. She looked back, saw the taillights of the truck vanish between the trees. The clearing once more empty, innocent beneath the stars. They walked home in silence, the adrenaline fading, leaving only exhaustion and the raw, pulsing knowledge of how close they had come. Karen's hands shook as she opened the farmhouse door. Eileen collapsed onto the couch, cheeks streaked with tears and dirt, but her eyes blazed with victory. "We saw them," she said. "We know where they go. We can stop them now." But even as hope sparked, Karen knew the stakes had changed. The faceless man was not just a phantom. He was flesh and bone, dangerous and desperate, willing to risk anything to keep his secret. And now she and Eileen were no longer just searching for Jonathan. They were part of the game, hunted as surely as any queen bee in the woods. She lay awake that night, Eileen sleeping fitfully beside her, listening to the deep, restless whisper of the maples. The secret was out in the open now. There would be no turning back. The storm that swept across Maple that night was a living thing. Wind shrieking through the trees, rain hammering the fields, thunder rolling so low and constant it rattled windows in their frames. It was the kind of storm that made people huddle closer to their kitchen lights and their loved ones, the kind that churned up secrets long buried beneath roots and memory. But for Karen, the worst of it was the silence that followed when the thunder faded and the night pressed in heavy and absolute. It was then she discovered Eileen was gone. At first, she didn't panic. She thought the girl had slipped out for air or maybe gone home to Annie's sky, wanting the warmth of her own bed and a sense of safety. But as the minutes ticked past, Karen's unease grew sharper, slicing through her exhaustion. She called Eileen's name through the hallways, searched the barn, the porch, the rows of silent hives. She called Annie, then Sheriff Lucas, her voice climbing higher with each unanswered ring. By the time she found the note scrawled in Eileen's hurried hand, left beneath Jonathan's old work gloves on the kitchen table, Karen's fear had set its claws. "I have to check the cave. I think I saw something. Don't worry, I'll be careful." The words were simple, but Karen felt the breath go out of her. She pressed the note to her heart and staggered outside, searching the dark for a sign, any sign of the girl. But the only reply was the wind. In the maples, the ache of loss returned sharper than before. She called Lucas again, this time reaching him. The line crackling with static and worry. "Eileen's gone." She left to check the cave, the whispering cave. "Please, you have to help." Lucas promised to send a deputy and start searching, his voice grim, the tiredness in it replaced by urgency. "Don't do anything alone, Karen," he warned. "Stay by the phone. We'll handle it." But Karen couldn't sit still. She drove to Annie Sky's house, rain streaking the windshield wipers, useless against the deluge. Annie met her at the door, her face already creased with dread. Together they tried Eileen's cell, called her friends, checked every trailhead and hiding spot the girl might know. Nothing. The woods had swallowed her, as they had so many others before. In the chaos, Karen's mind raced. Every story she'd uncovered, the old reports, the grainy photos, the half-whispered warnings flared to life, their meaning twisting in the lightning's glare. The disappearances, the missing children and adults, the hives torn open and emptied, it was all part of a pattern, a sickness festering in Maple's heart for decades. Annie, stoic through the search, finally broke her silence as they sat in her dim kitchen steaming tea untouched on the table. "I knew this day would come," she murmured. "The forest keeps its debts, Karen. When the wrong people learn its paths, it's the children who pay." Karen pressed her hands to her eyes. "What do you mean?" Annie hesitated, then spoke her words slow and careful, as if feeling for the edges of an old wound. "You know the stories about people vanishing the hives, stolen the animals found without a mark? For years we thought it was bad luck, the work of a hungry spirit, or men driven mad by greed. But it's more than that. It's organized. There are people, strangers and neighbors alike, who profit from the forest's gifts. Queen bees fetch more on the black market than gold. The rarest are worth fortunes. And Maple, with its wild, untouched groves, is the perfect hiding place. The perfect crossroads." She stared out the window at the pouring rain. "I heard stories as a child, long before you came here. Of men coming from the city bringing trucks and money-making deals with those desperate enough to look the other way. They used the woods to hide their work-moving bees, and when they wanted people too. Anyone who stumbled on their paths was made to disappear." Karen felt a chill that had nothing to do with the storm. "Is that what happened to Jonathan?" she whispered. "Is that what's happening to Elin?" Annie nodded. "Your husband was close to the truth. He saw something he shouldn't. Maybe he tried to stop them, maybe he tried to help. It doesn't matter now, they took him to keep their secret. And now Elin? She's a witness. Or a warning." The realization hollowed Karen out. She felt the terror that had haunted Maple for generations, now sharpened to a single point. Elin, a child out in the night, hunted by men who cared for nothing but profit and power. With dawn, the storm broke. Sheriff Lucas arrived with 2 deputies, their faces set and pale. The search began anew, this time focused and desperate. Tracking dogs deployed along the muddy trails, volunteers called from every corner of the county. But the woods seemed to have closed over Elin as thoroughly as they had over Jonathan. Every time Karen thought she saw a sign, a footprint in the mud, a flash of red jacket in the ferns, it slipped away like a ghost. At midday, one of the searchers found a scrap of cloth snagged on a low branch near the cave's entrance, bloodied and torn. Karen recognized it instantly, Elin's old flannel shirt, the one she'd worn that night. There were scuff marks in the earth, the deep tread of boots, the broken twigs that spoke of a struggle. No animal had done this. No Wendigo or shadow spirit. This was the work of men. Lucas knelt by the cave, running his hands over the stone, his voice tight with frustration. "We're dealing with something big," he told Karen. "Bigger than Maple? This isn't just poachers. It's organized crime, people with money, with resources. They know the land better than we do. They know how to hide." As the search ground on hope grew thin and sharp, the Ojibwe community rallied, spreading word through the reservation and across the border, calling in favors from distant cousins and old friends. Old women lit candles, muttered prayers in languages that had survived centuries. The men gathered silent and fierce, vowing that this time they would not let Maple's children be stolen without a fight. And yet, for all their determination, the fear remained. It hung in every whispered conversation, every sidelong glance at the woods, every time a child strayed too close to the trees. The knowledge that the enemy could be anyone, a neighbor, a friend, a stranger, passing through, spread like rot. It was in this crucible of dread and determination that Karen found her resolve. She would not be cowed. She would not let the same shadow that had stolen her husband take Elin too. She pressed Lucas for more, demanded help from the provincial police, reached out to the media, forced the story into the open where the traffickers could not hide behind fear and silence. But it was a story from the oldest man in the community, Grandpa Isaac, that finally brought everything into focus. In the glow of a campfire, surrounded by anxious families and tired searchers, Isaac recounted the truth he'd carried for decades. They come for the bees. Yes, but that's not all. They move them. The queens in crates with air holes and honeycombs ship them overseas to the highest bidder. Russia, China, the Gulf. But sometimes, when someone gets in the way, they're taken too. Maple is just a stop, a place to hide the spoils before they vanish forever. He looked at Karen, his eyes watery but burning with conviction. You want your girl back, you have to go where they keep the crates. They never move everything at once. There is always one place hidden close to water, close to the deepest trees. Find that place, and you'll find your truth. With new purpose, Karen gripped Annie's hand, her own fear replaced by a raw, determined hope. The truth was out the forest's secret now in the open. And with the eyes of the whole community at her back, Karen vowed she would walk into the darkness, no matter what waited there, and bring Elin and maybe Jonathan home. The rain had come back heavy, a hard and ceaseless drumming that blurred the world beyond Karen's windshield into streaks of silver and black. She drove, hands gripping the wheel, her jaw clenched so tight it hurt. Every streetlight cast a ghostly reflection. Every bend in the road felt like a border between the life she'd known and the dark unknown waiting in the heart of Maple. She'd never felt so alone, and never so determined, because somewhere out there, Elin was scared, maybe hurt, maybe worse. And Karen wasn't going to let her go the way Jonathan had disappeared into the silent maw of the woods. She parked outside the reservation's small community center, where word had gone out that an emergency meeting was gathering Ojibwe elders, a handful of deputies, townsfolk with flashlights and rifles clutched to their chests, some wide-eyed, some already grieving. But the first face Karen saw in the crowded foyer was a stranger's, or so she thought, until he stepped forward into the lamplight, and she saw the lines of kinship, of shared loss in his eyes. He was tall. The strength in his frame eroded, but not gone hair. Sheared short and streaked with silver. His eyes were deep and hard, but there was a trembling there, the ghost of some old wound. You must be Karen Miller, he said quietly. I'm Thomas, Elin's father. Karen's breath caught. She'd never met Elin's father, only heard the whispers, how he'd once been a detective. How he'd lost his son Elin's older brother years ago in these same woods. How he'd vanished into grief and then eventually exile until Annie Skye took Elin in to shield her from the shadow that loss had cast. She searched his face for blame, for anger, for the kind of judgment she'd been fending off for weeks. But Thomas only nodded, his own voice raw with hurt. She's my only one now. I know what it's like to lose a child. I'm not losing another. Together they found Lucas at the edge of the crowd, his radio crackling with static, his face creased by sleeplessness. We've got a new lead, he told them, voice low. We found something, maybe a way in. Come with me. They followed him to the command truck parked in the lot. A map of the county was spread out on the hood, dark with rainwater. Lucas explained, We've been monitoring emergency frequencies just in case anyone's got a phone or a transmitter. Most of it's static weather animal tags. But we caught a blip last night. Short, weak, but it's on a band Jonathan used for his hives when he'd tagged the queens, monitor their locations. I checked, one of his old transmitters is still alive somewhere near the caves. Karen stared at the map, her heart lurching. He could be alive. Lucas shook his head, gentle but honest. If it's him, he's in trouble. The signal's weak, buried, maybe damaged. But it's hope. Thomas studied the map, his eyes narrowing. I know that ridge. There's a sinkhole near the south end. My son, we looked there once. He said nothing more, but the memory weighed the air between them. A small team formed that night, bound not by duty, but by grief, desperation, and the slim hope that somewhere beneath the earth, life still flickered. Karen, Thomas, Lucas, Daniel Bird, and a young deputy named Michelle set out beneath the cover of rain flashlights, wrapped in red cloth, voices low and measured. Each step into the forest felt like a trespass, a journey into the heart of all their worst memories, and the place where just maybe the future could still be saved. The woods were alive with rain. Every branch dripped, every leaf shivered under the weight of water. Mud sucked at their boots' roots, caught their ankles. The only constant was the drone of the rain and under it the steady pulse of the tracking device Thomas carried, its small screen, blipping faintly with each step. The closer they drew to the ridge, the stronger the signal, never strong, never clear, but enough to pull them onward through the sucking dark. It was nearly midnight when they reached the old sinkhole. The earth around it raw and gouged, marked by tire tracks, and the deep furrows of crates dragged from the clearing to the shadowy mouth below. Here the forest was utterly silent, save for the hush of rain and the tremble of breath. Thomas knelt by the edge, working with gloved hands to brush aside sodden leaves, revealing a faint glint of metal, the battered housing of Jonathan's transmitter, half buried in mud. The signal was faint but steady, a heartbeat in the gloom. Karen felt her knees give way. She pressed a hand to her mouth, hope and terror tangled together in her chest. He's close. He has to be close. They moved as one, slipping down the side of the sinkhole into a sloping tunnel that opened almost imperceptibly into the side of the hill. The air grew colder, the light thinner. The sound of the rain above replaced by something else, a low, persistent humming, rising and falling in waves. It was not the wind nor the movement of water underground. It was the unmistakable sound of bees, hundreds, maybe thousands, moving somewhere ahead in the dark. Michelle switched off her light, motioning for the others to follow. They moved slowly, every step an act of faith. The passage narrowed, the hum growing louder. Layered now with something new, the faint, desperate scrape of metal on stone, a cough, a muffled sob. Thomas's voice shook as he whispered, "Listen. Do you hear that someone's alive?" They pressed deeper, following the curve of the tunnel, hearts racing. The sound of bees was almost unbearable now, a wild, unnatural vibration that made the air itself seem to shimmer. The deeper they went, the more it became clear this was not a natural hive. This was forced, cultivated, amplified by human hands. Suddenly Karen froze, every nerve alight. Up ahead, beyond a bend, the tunnel opened into a chamber, faint light spilling from a battery lantern on the far side. Shadows moved, figures huddled against the wall cages stacked the metallic glint of tools and crates. In the center, a figure paced, barking orders in a harsh, guttural voice. Karen's breath caught. She saw in flashes faces. She recognized Jonathan's beard grown wild. A woman from the next farm, over her eyes swollen shut. Children, dirty and silent, clutching one another for comfort. And there Elin, her braid undone, face streaked with fear and tears, but alive, her eyes fixed on the newcomers with a mixture of hope and terror. The group ducked back, adrenaline burning through their exhaustion. Lucas touched Karen's shoulder, his voice barely audible. "We'll have to move fast. There's more than we thought. We'll call for backup, but if they try to run..." Thomas gripped his arm. "We can't wait. If they hear us, if they realize we're here, they'll kill them or move them before help arrives." Karen felt everything: Jonathan's absence, Elin's fear. The years of missing names in Maple gather inside her like a storm. There was no more time for caution, no more room for fear. She nodded, squeezing Thomas's hand, and the group made their plan in fierce, whispered urgency. Outside, the storm had slowed to a drizzle. But in the earth below, all of Maple's pain, hope, and courage had gathered ready at last to break the silence. They moved as one through the mouth of the cave. Karen, Thomas, Lucas, Daniel, Michelle, breath held, feet silent, adrenaline pounding in their ears. Only the ghosts of the old forest could have heard them. As they crept deeper, the walls slick and cold, the hum of bees now pulsing through the very stone. Time lost all meaning in the dark. Only the distant, muffled voices ahead tethered them to purpose. It was Michelle who signaled first, the faint glow of battery lanterns up ahead, the copper stink of sweat and fear. She crouched low, Karen beside her. The others fanned out against the cave's curve. From their hidden vantage, the chamber opened. Cages, battered crates, splinters of comb, and a dozen huddled figures. And Jonathan, unshaven, blood dried in his beard, eyes wild, chained by the ankle to an iron ring. He saw Karen, and in that moment, despite everything, his hope shone clear as fire. Elin, battered but unbroken, pressed herself against the bars of her own makeshift pen. There were others, 2 men, 3 children, a woman moaning softly, her arms splinted with duct tape. Every soul in that place bore the exhaustion and terror of captivity. The only thing that moved freely was the air itself thick with the hypnotic sound of bees, hundreds of them angry and displaced, crawling the honeyed walls in twitching golden clusters. At the chamber's center stood the man they all felt before they saw Alexander. He was broad-shouldered hair, shorn to stubble, a face like cold stone carved by violence and disappointment. His voice, when it rang out English laced with Slavic ice, stilled even the buzzing in the cave. "You think I don't see you?" he called into the dark, a gun loose in his hand. "You come here heroes, always heroes. Let me show you what becomes of heroes." Thomas stiffened, rage and dread warring on his face. Karen's mind spun, searching for a plan for any weakness. But Alexander had lived 100 lives in a dozen underworlds. His eyes missed nothing. "You," he said, pointing the barrel at Karen as she inched forward, hands raised. "Step out, or I shoot the girl." The world narrowed to a pinpoint. Karen stepped into the lantern light, blinking against its harsh glare. She tried to speak to reason, but Alexander barked a command, and one of his men seized her, wrenching her arm behind her back, the cold press of a blade at her throat. "I'm not afraid of you," she managed, her voice trembling. Alexander laughed, a hollow, joyless sound. "You should be. I have crossed oceans, killed for less." He moved closer, gun still raised, but it was then that Elin acted. She'd been waiting, small hands working a battered canister in the straw. With a practiced flick, she upended it into a half-burned heap of honeycomb and rags. Smoke billowed instantly, rich, pungent, the sort Jonathan had always used to calm the hives. But now, in this stifling underworld, it became a weapon. The bees, already angry, surged in wild confusion, a living cloud of panic and stings. Alexander cursed, clawing at his face as the swarm enveloped him. In the chaos, Karen wrenched free, driving her elbow into her captor's ribs. Thomas and Daniel lunged for the keys, hands shaking, working the locks on the cages. Michelle covered the group, her sidearm out, keeping the other men back. But Alexander was ruthless. Blinded and shrieking, he fired blindly into the smoke bullets pinging off stone. Now Thomas yelled, dragging Elin and Jonathan clear as the captives poured into the tunnel behind them. The cave was a battlefield of shadows, shouts, gunfire, the primal scream of Alexander as bees drove him to his knees. Karen shoved Elin ahead, scooping up a terrified child in her arms. Daniel lifted the wounded woman. Michelle fired 2 more shots as Alexander staggered to his feet, face a mask of welts, his hate seething in every ragged breath. They ran boots, sliding on mud shoulders, scraping stone, the tunnel collapsing behind them into roars and buzzing. Ahead, the first glimmer of moonlight bled through the narrow mouth of the cave. But the worst was not over. At the entrance, 2 more of Alexander's men waited, radios squawking with panicked orders in Russian and French. The first lunged, swinging a crowbar, but Thomas met him head-on, fury and fear making him reckless. He grappled, teeth gritted, the 2 men falling into the mud. Michelle dropped the other with a single shattering blow. "Go!" Karen screamed, voice breaking. The group exploded into the open, Elin and the children racing into the trees, Daniel and Karen half carrying Jonathan Lucas and Michelle covering the rear. And then a sound that split the night, the wild rising whine of police sirens. Headlights flickered through the trees, sweeping the battered group in blue and red halos. "They're here," Elin shouted, hope returning for the first time in days. Alexander and his men, realizing the net had closed, fled into the underbrush. But police dogs were already on their trail, deputies bursting from SUVs, guns drawn, voices booming in the chaos. A searchlight from a hovering helicopter sliced through the branches, painting everything in stark, artificial daylight. Karen staggered through the clearing, clutching Jonathan, his voice raw with disbelief. "You found me? You found us?" She pressed her forehead to his tears, lost in rain and sweat. For minutes that felt like hours, chaos reigned. Officers herded the captives to safety. Paramedics swarmed the wounded, and deputies crashed through the woods in pursuit of the fleeing traffickers. In the end, Alexander was captured, dragged into the floodlight's glare, face swollen with stings, and hate defiance still burning in his ruined eyes. But it was the moment in the clearing under the white blaze of the chopper that the real victory was felt. Tron and Jonathan, Elin together, at last clinging to one another, their bodies battered, but their spirits unbroken. Behind them, the cave whispered, its last empty now, but echoing with the sound of bees and the memory of the courage it had witnessed. In the heart of Maple, the nightmare was over. But the story of healing and justice and impossible hope, was only just beginning. Rain hammered the broken clearing above the cave, as chaos surged in the darkness below, sirens and helicopter rotors turning the forest night into a fractured, desperate battlefield. But deep in the belly of the earth, where the passageways twisted and the air vibrated with bees' agitated hum, a final terrible confrontation was already taking shape, one that would demand everything left of courage, love, and sacrifice. In the confusion after the rescue with injured captives stumbling toward the light, Alexander did what only a monster without remorse would do. He seized Elin, dragging her roughly from her father's desperate grasp. His gun pressed hard against her temple, his knuckles white sweat and bee venom streaking his scarred face. Back he screamed, voice echoing off the stone eyes, wild and cornered. "Everyone back, or I kill her. You want to be heroes? Watch her die first." The world stopped. The wailing sirens faded, the flashlights stilled. In the cave's blue gloom, Elin's small body shook, but her eyes, so full of pain and fear, locked on Karen's, on Jonathan's. Karen tried to move forward, but Michelle's hand gripped her shoulder, whispering, "He'll do it. He's lost everything now." Jonathan, barely standing, blood crusted on his brow, pushed past the others. He'd been starved and beaten, left to die. But as he saw Alexander with Elin, a force rose in him fiercer than any pain or exhaustion. He spoke, his voice rasping but unbroken. "Let her go, Alexander. It's over. The police are here. You're finished. Don't do this." Alexander's mouth twisted. He shifted his grip, dragging Elin closer, gun trembling. "You think I care about police? I survived worse than this. You took everything from me, my shipment, my freedom. You will watch her die, old man. Unless you want to trade." Silence. Rainwater seeped down the cave walls in silver threads. Karen felt her soul tear in two, the urge to leap, to beg, to bargain with anything left of fate. Michelle edged to the side, eyes darting for a shot, but Alexander spotted her, waved the gun wildly. "No tricks, no heroes." Elin's voice was a whisper, barely there, but so brave it hurt to hear. "Please let me go. You can run. Please." Alexander shook his head, his face a ruin of fury and grief. "No one gets out. No one. You think you're strong. You think you can win." Then, in a move so desperate and reckless, it would live forever in the memory of all who saw it, Jonathan hurled himself at Alexander's arms, out body a shield. Now he shouted, the last of his strength flaring like lightning. He collided with Alexander, sending the gun spinning into the dust. Elin broke free, stumbling into Michelle's arms as the two men crashed to the ground. The cave erupted in violence. Alexander, wild with rage, fought like a wounded animal, clawing and striking. Jonathan grappled him, holding on even as Alexander's fists pummeled his ribs. Karen saw the gun lying between them, a shape of black, impossible fate. She dove, hands closing on the cold steel heart, shattering. At that instant, a deafening boom shook the cave. One of Alexander's men, desperate and cornered, had triggered the explosives the traffickers kept for destroying evidence charges wedged in the weakest seams of the ancient stone. The roof above them began to crack, dust and pebbles raining down, the world trembling with imminent collapse. Michelle and Thomas herded the survivors to the exit. Voices cracking, "Run, go now." But Karen, gun in hand, stood frozen, Alexander's hands still clamped around Jonathan's throat. His eyes mad with the knowledge that everything was lost. Time slowed. Alexander reached for the gun, murder in his gaze. In that flickering second, Karen raised the weapon, her arms shaking, every instinct screaming, and fired. The shot echoed through the chamber louder than thunder. Alexander fell back, his grip slackening. Jonathan rolled free, gasping, blood seeping through his shirt, but alive. Karen's knees buckled. The cave shuddered, another blast sounding deeper in the rock. "Out! Out!" Michelle roared, dragging Karen by the arm. The group staggered for the exit, stone splitting behind them, the path caving in. Dust and smoke filled the air. Somewhere behind Alexander's dying screams were lost to the roar of collapsing stone. In a nightmare of noise and darkness, the survivors, Karen, Jonathan, Elin, Thomas, Michelle, the wounded police officer, tumbled from the mouth of the cave just as the hillside gave way, earth swallowing the evil that had festered there for years. Helicopter lights cut through the dust, casting the battered weeping group in a halo of white and blue. Paramedics ran to meet them, voices, urgent, hands gentle. Karen fell to her knees in the mud, arms around Elin. Jonathan sinking beside her, trembling but alive. Thomas pulled his daughter close, tears streaking his weathered face. It was over. The horror buried at last, the silence of the riven earth, filled now with the sound of rescue, of hope, of something like peace. Yet for all their courage, the scars would remain a price paid in blood and terror. And above all, in the love that had pulled them through. As the police cordoned off the shattered cave, as the rain eased and dawn threatened the horizon, Maple's Woods, so long a place of loss, became for the first time a place of reunion, of sacrifice, and of healing that would echo for generations. In the first tremulous hour after the cave-in, Maple's forest was alive with chaos and light. Sirens wailed and red strobes painted the trunks of ancient trees. The thumping helicopter blades drove rain and smoke into the clearing until the air felt electric, trembling with possibility and fear. And in the center of it all, muddy, bruised, and barely able to stand, Karen, Jonathan, and Elin clung together. The world narrowed to that single miraculous embrace. They were alive. After everything, they were alive. Jonathan, gaunt and trembling, pressed his forehead to Karen's, his battered hands trembling as he cradled her face. "You found me," he whispered, the words breaking in his throat. "You never stopped." His voice carried all the weight of the lost years, the hope that had nearly withered, the horror of being forgotten, and the indescribable relief of coming home. Elin was pressed between them, her face buried in Karen's jacket sobs, racking her small frame as Jonathan's arms folded around her, promising a protection he'd nearly been robbed of forever. For a few suspended seconds, the wider world faded. No sirens, no shouts, no searching floodlights. Just breath and touch and tears. It was only the insistent voice of a paramedic, gentle, careful, but firm, that broke the spell. "We need to get you checked out, all of you. There's an ambulance waiting." And so, still holding on to each other, they let themselves be led into the light. The triage tents were a bright oasis in the mud and ruin. Dozens of EMTs moved in a practiced dance, checking wounds, starting IVs, pressing thermal blankets around the dazed survivors. The other freed captives huddled nearby, some with faces alight with disbelief, others stunned to the edge of catatonia. Jonathan was quickly swarmed, his wounds cleaned and dressed, his hand never letting go of Karen's. Elin was checked for concussion and shock, her small form wrapped in a blanket so large it nearly swallowed her whole. Karen could barely answer the medic's questions. Her eyes never left her family. Beyond the tent, the law descended, officers from the OPP and RCMP K9 teams, evidence techs in Tyvek suits. The storm had passed, but left behind a world in shambles. The old cave mouth, now collapsed and ringed by caution tape, was all that remained of the traffickers' lair. Teams picked through the shattered stone and mud-recovering crates, cages, and the last grim traces of the Operation Bloody Rags, shipping manifests in a dozen languages. Jars of honey spiked with tranquilizers, even passports and burner phones, some marked with names that would later match open cases from across 3 provinces and 2 countries. What they found was staggering. The makeshift cells had been home to at least 17 missing people, many of them children. Maps recovered from Alexander's pocket revealed an international web routes traced from Ontario through Quebec to Montreal, then overseas to Europe, Asia, the Middle East. At the heart of it, the illicit traffic in queen bees, and even more horrifically, human beings. The realization swept through the assembled police and community like a sickness. There were mutters of disbelief, rage, then a solemn burning determination. The scale of the evil was bigger than any one farm, any single family's tragedy. But the night's rescue had brought hope. The network had been shattered here, at least for now. Maple's woods had become the unlikely ground for the unraveling of an international ring. Karen stood at the edge of the tent, watching as the officers worked. She saw in the shifting crowd the faces of other families, a grandmother cradling a lost child, a teenage boy limping into his father's arms, a middle-aged woman, face scarred and thin, weeping as she dialed a number from memory for the first time in years. Each reunion was a story and echo of her own, and the tears came harder for the weight of all that loss and joy mingled together. It was then, as the dawn crept gray and hopeful over the horizon, that Thomas Sky found them, limping, bandaged eyes red, but blazing with relief. He crossed the mud shoulders squared and folded Elin into a wordless embrace that spoke of everything years of pain had not taken from him. "You came home," he murmured, voice thick. "You came back." For Elin, who had lived so long with absence, the feeling was overwhelming. She gripped her father as if to anchor herself in this new world of safety, her tears soaking his battered jacket. Nearby, Annie Sky watched, hands folded in prayer, eyes shining. She moved to Karen, squeezing her hand. "The forest takes and it gives," she whispered. "You brought her back? You brought all of them back." Karen couldn't speak. She only nodded, letting the weight of relief fill her at last. Lucas, mud-stained and exhausted, approached the group, his expression softening. "You did it, Karen. You all did. You saved more lives tonight than we'll ever know." But Karen shook her head. "It was everyone. You, Elin, the whole community. It was all of us." The paramedics began loading the last survivors into ambulances, their faces hollow but shining with hope. The scene was equal parts triumph and aftermath. A field hospital in the woods, dreams sewn together with stitches and tears. As the sun rose golden through the thinning clouds, the first birds began to sing their voices, tentative but real. And for the first time in years, the song was one of hope, not just for the Miller family, but for all of Maple. Later in the quiet, after Karen sat between Jonathan and Elin as the world spun on, she looked at the ragged little family they'd become, at the faces around her old wounds. Stitched with new promise, grief tempered with reunion. For a moment she let herself believe in healing, that even after the darkest night there could be dawn. That families could knit themselves back together, no matter how long the forest had kept them apart. In Maple, scars would remain and memories would echo. But this night, this impossible, heart-shattering, joyful night, would be remembered as the moment hope returned, blazing in the dawn after 1,000 days of shadow. In the golden weeks that followed the night of the rescue, the scars on Maple's woods began to close slowly, fitfully, never quite erasing what had happened, but letting the first shoots of hope and healing push through. It started as so many things did at the old Miller farm, where Jonathan recovered under the vigilant care of Karen and Elin, his strength returning inch by inch as the wounds of captivity gave way to the stubborn, steady pulse of life. The days were filled with the gentle chaos of rebuilding broken hives. Mended the land, walked end to end for signs of tampering, and the empty spaces in the house gradually reclaimed. At first, Jonathan's hands shook when he tried to work. Nightmares pressed in at odd hours. But Elin, with the resilience of youth and the wisdom of having survived the dark, coaxed him back to the bee yard each morning, showing him the new queens they'd rescued, letting the humming of the hives settle his nerves. Karen was always near her laughter, never quite as easy as before, her eyes always searching the edge of the woods. But together, they formed a circle the pain could not breach. News of what had happened of the international ring destroyed the captives, freed the forest's secret darkness, finally brought to light, spread through the region. There was grief, of course, for those who would not return, but also a powerful sense of unity. A community that had nearly been broken was now determined to stand together. It was Karen who suggested one cool morning that they do more than simply restore the hives. "Let's make this a sanctuary," she said, her voice firm. "A place where the queens are safe, where people can learn, and where no one human or bee goes missing again." So the work began in earnest. Jonathan poured himself into the project, his eyes alight for the first time in years. He reached out to old friends, to researchers at Guelph and Toronto, to Ojibwe elders with generations of knowledge. Elin became the voice of the new effort visiting classrooms, telling her story, helping other kids understand what it meant to protect, to defend, to remember. The fields around the Miller farm flourished wildflowers planted for the bees, meadows left untamed as corridors for every living thing. As the seasons turned and the air softened, the village planned a celebration unlike any before. They called it Resurgence Day, the Day of Renewal. Word spread, drawing not only families from Maple, but visitors from neighboring towns, scientists, teachers, law enforcement, and most crucially, the Ojibwe and other First Nations who had carried the forest's wisdom all along. On the edge of the woods, tables were set with honey and bread, wild berries, and fry bread. The air bright with music drumming and guitar children's laughter mixing with the steady, hopeful thrum of bee wings. Annie Skye led a prayer in Ojibwe and English, her voice clear and fierce, as she called on the spirits of the land to watch over the living and the lost. Candles were lit in memory of those who never came home. Bells rang for every survivor. Jonathan spoke quietly to the crowd, his voice rough with emotion. This land gave us everything, honey, beauty, even a second chance. We owe it everything back. When he finished, Karen read the names of those saved. Each answered by a chorus of voices. Elin, in her yellow dress, placed a basket of queen bees at the altar they'd built of stone and wildflower. May they always find their way home, she whispered. The heart of the celebration was not only remembrance, but action. Inspired by what they'd learned, the community created the Maple Watch, a rural alert network, joining local farms, Ojibwe Rangers, and the OPP. Radios were distributed, code words agreed upon, volunteers trained to patrol the woods, especially at night. It was not about fear, but vigilance, a promise that no child or queen would vanish unnoticed again. Workshops sprouted up, beekeeping lessons, survival training, cultural storytelling, first aid. The Miller Sanctuary grew the fields alive, not just with bees, but with families learning, planting, building together. Scientists helped restore the balance, tracking wild bees, repairing ecosystems. Elders taught the old ways, showing how to read the forest's signs, how to ask permission of the land, how to heal with patience. For Karen, Jonathan, and Elin, the rhythm of daily life was both ordinary and miraculous. They planted trees to replace those cut or damaged. They painted signs in 3 languages, English, French, Ojibwe, welcoming all, warning away those who would harm. At dusk, they often walked the edge of the woods, listening to the hush, their shadows stretching long over the grass. There were still bad nights, of course, memories that flared, empty chairs at community gatherings, scars that ached with the change of weather. But there was also a sense that something ancient had been put right, that the forest would remember the courage as well as the suffering. The festival became an annual tradition. Every Resurgence Day, the village came together. Old wounds honored, new dreams planted. And at the heart of it all stood the Miller family, changed, but unbroken, their legacy now a living thing. A place where healing was possible, where bees and people could thrive, and where in the dappled light beneath the maples, the future shone bright as honey. Dawn broke gently over Maple, pouring soft gold through the trembling leaves. The mist in the clearings rising like a quiet prayer. For the first time in years, the forest felt unburdened, no longer a place that swallowed secrets, but one that breathed hope. The only sound that dared to break the silence was the peaceful, insistent hum of bees drifting from the hives at the Miller Sanctuary, weaving in and out of sunlight, their music a testament that life, fragile, resilient, always returns. Jonathan stood in the tall grass arms wrapped around Karen and Elin, his eyes shining with gratitude he could never quite speak. There was laughter now, real and whole, as Elin darted from flower to flower, pausing to show a little girl the velvety weight of a queen bee on her palm. She had become a legend in the village, an emblem of hope of 2 worlds that had once eyed each other with suspicion, now joined in purpose, the Ojibwe and the farmers, the keepers of old wisdom and the stewards of the land. Children crowded around Karen as she led them along the neat rows of hives, her voice low and steady, patient, as she taught them the secrets of honey and courage. Every queen, she explained, means a new beginning. Every hive is a family, like ours. The children listened wide-eyed as Karen spun the story of Maple's darkness and its breaking the bravery of those who refused to let fear win the miracle of a second chance. She paused before the largest hive, letting the sunlight catch the swirling wings. Remember, courage isn't being fearless. It's doing what's right even when you're scared. There was a hush, and then one small voice piped up. Will we always be safe now? Karen smiled, brushing a stray curl from the girl's cheek. We'll always have each other, and that's what makes us safe. At the edge of the field, Elin and Thomas watched the seen hands link their silence deeper than words. For Elin, this was the world she had only dared dream of, a place where she belonged, not as a secret or a symbol, but as a bridge. She moved easily between the elders and the young, the two languages flowing from her lips, her laughter a kind of blessing on the wounded land. As the sun climbed higher, more families arrived, filling the meadow with music and promise. There was bread and honey, and songs in Ojibwe and English, and stories told under the shade of the oldest maple stories, not just of loss, but of survival, of forgiveness, and of what it means to heal together. Jonathan took a moment away from the crowd, kneeling by a small stone marker at the edge of the grove, a quiet memorial for those who never came home. He closed his eyes, letting the bees circle him, a living benediction. He murmured a promise not just to the past, but to the future, that their home would never again be a place of darkness, that their family rebuilt from ashes would stand as long as the forest did. Nearby, Karen called for one last group photo, her arm around Elin's shoulders, Jonathan at her side. The children crowded in, their faces shining. The camera clicked, and for a heartbeat, the world was still a perfect sunlit memory to hold against whatever storms might come. And when the children ran off chasing butterflies and dreams, Karen stood at the threshold of the wood, her heart full. She looked to Elin and Jonathan, to the bustling sanctuary, to the distant village, and she saw not the shadows that had once ruled Maple, but the fierce, unstoppable light of people who choose each other again and again, despite the darkness. In the closing moment, the camera lingered on the morning hives, bees in a dance of perpetual return, wings shining. Over the scene, as the screen faded to white, words emerged, gentle but certain, a promise and a benediction. In a place that once knew only shadows, now rises the light of memory, of kindness, and of new beginnings.